Welcome to Uncle Nene's Nerdcast. I'm your host, Nathan Fletcher, aka Uncle Nene. Today we're delving into two very amazing pieces of work, intricate themes of power and human nature. That is Game of Thrones and Clockwork Orange. To navigate these complex narratives, we have the pleasure of hosting a multifaceted artist whose career spans acting, screenwriting, filmmaking, music, and modeling. Our guest, Dean Simone, is known for his compelling portrayal of legendary sports writer Jim Murray in HBO's Winning Time: The Rise of the Lakers Dynasty. All right, welcome to the show, Dean.
Thanks for having me, Nathan.
Today's show, we're going to talk about Game of Thrones and A Clockwork Orange, two amazing bodies of work. I think most of our audience is going to know Game of Thrones. Some of the younger folks won't be familiar with The Clockwork Orange. Hopefully, they will look at it after this because it is really an incredible body of work. Stanley Kubrick is a genius. And so I really encourage people to take a look at that if you haven't. What fascinates you about these two stories? Is there anything that kind of strikes you as something that's similar that you were like, oh, I hadn't thought of these things going together, but now that you mention it, what anything jump out at you?
Well, I think both stories are fascinating studies in power and striving for power and the abuse of power and what we will do in the name of power. And I think that this is such a great part of the human condition. We see it every day in the news. We see it every day in our families. We see it every day uh, in our towns. It's all around. And I think that both of them deal with power in such a profound, honest way and a very entertaining way as well. Humor in both things, violence in both things, just handled so well in different ways. So I think that's the main theme that I feel it happens in both.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think that one of the things that I really appreciate anytime a series can take a character, make you hate them, and then later in that series, you're cheering for them. That is impeccable writing and acting and directing everything because and you see that particularly. I'm thinking in Game of Thrones, one thing that comes to mind, and then we'll get on to A Clockwork Orange. But in Game of Thrones, you have characters like Jaime Lannister, the Hound becomes a huge fan favorite. How to that what are your thoughts on that? That one of that things that they do where that moral ambiguity in Game of Thrones, anything kind of jumps to mind on that front?
Well, the Hound is a really fascinating character. I really feel like he's that guy that's in it for himself, in it for revenge, and then all of a sudden he realizes that there's something underneath all that that's very human. And it's really it's like Harrison Ford in Star Wars. It's the same sort of a guy. It's like, I'm in it for myself. I'm not in it for anybody else. And then all of a sudden this thing emerges that you see, and just we love characters like that. And it was just portrayed so well. And really, honestly, what he did for the daughter. What was the daughter's name? Who was she was on the quest of revenge.
Arya.
Arya, yeah. So she was out there on that revenge quest, and then he was basically telling her, "Hey, it's not worth it. You're left with nothing in the very end." And then when he has to face his own brother, spoiler alert. Close your ears. When he has to,
I think they'll have seen it,
they'll
hopefully.
have seen it. Yeah, yeah. It's really, I mean, the story just comes together beautifully with that. But I think we always love that character, that is like is a hero in spite of himself, like
Yeah,
most of
I
us.
agree completely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, there is that. He's a bit prophetic when he talks to her about, you know, you'll have nothing, and then at the end, he dies for revenge. For
Yeah,
vengeance sake.
yeah.
Um, let's move over to A Clockwork Orange. So I think, of course, the ultra violent criminal is the protagonist. Alex is charming. His narration is interesting. There's that, reversal where the bad guy is victimized by even more oppressive system. You know, take me through kind of, I think your recollection of that, and how it affected you, maybe the first time you've seen it, and as time goes by, when you look back, is there kind of a different perspective?
Yeah, I remember first seeing that as a young actor and musician out here in Los Angeles, and I had a friend who was like an older mentor, actually a director who I've worked with a few times, and I'm still friends with him. We still work together from time to time. So we went to see it. I remember being, I think it was probably about 19 or 20, and I don't think I ever remember seeing a protagonist that was such a reprehensible character who was so charming and so funny and likable. And it was really an amazing job by Kubrick to show Alex that way, because it could have been so easy to show him in a villainous way. I miss that about cinema from those days, where I do believe that there was a little bit more of that. Won't call it ambivalence, but it definitely shows both sides of who a character is. And I think with Alex, had he had been more of a monstrous character or less of an accessible character, I think it would have been harder for us to really get the gist of the whole piece. We had to feel that charm, and we also had to put ourselves in this position of this person who's a murderer and a rapist and so out for himself in so many ways. But we felt for him for the obvious reasons.
Yeah, what do you think? And this is getting a little more or less filmmaking and more psychology, but I have a question. What
Bring
do
it
you
on.
think
I love that stuff.
what do you think it says about people that I think most people are generally good people and yet entertained by charming evil? What
Mm.
does that say about us?
Okay, well, to me, I think it's not as much charming evil as much as it is integrity and
Okay.
honesty with oneself. So I feel like, yes, we do like the charming evil, but we also feel like there's a deliciousness to it when we feel like that person is being true to themselves. We would rather see a horrible character who's charming, who is true to their nature, than
Hmm.
somebody who's beautiful and acts nice and says all the right things, and we think that they're completely full of crap. And then for us, it's sort of like we're not buying it, we're not having it, and we can't identify with it. So I think we always like that. And then I also think that there's an element of, it's like going to a the haunted mansion or something. It's like we like to be entertained by that of which we're afraid of in a certain respect in ourselves and in others. So I think that that character is always, can always strike a chord in us if it's done with charm and it's done with taste. And we see, look at not to change to another film, but in the Kubrick world, The Shining, same exact thing.
Yes.
Terrible,
Yep.
terrible
Yeah.
character, but
Yeah.
Nicholson plays it, and we're like, okay.
Give me more. Give me more. Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. It's also, I think, and if I think of Tony Soprano's character, where he's a bad guy, not well adjusted, yet he's likable and he's authentic in a way that you feel like, well, he's a bad guy, but he's an honest bad guy, if there is such a thing. He is he is what he is. He says that one line, I am what I am. And so I think that there, maybe that is true. There's that authenticity piece that people want to see more of, maybe because everywhere else in life we don't get it.
That is authenticity is the word. That is most definitely, I think, the key element to it. And I think in Clockwork Orange, they were literally in. And let's think about that for a second. Really, what was the aim of the government in Clockwork Orange? Like, Nathan, in your opinion, what was the reason that they were doing this method on little Alex? What was
Oh,
their motive?
yeah, the government's tactics. Oh man, it's hard to say. Control is really what it's about, I think.
I totally agree with you. 100%. I think that's right. It was. all about control. So for a government, they don't care if they take whatever the intrinsic personal aspect of each one of us, who we are. In this, they'll gut it in order to be able to control. In order to be able to control, they have power and they can do the things that they want to do. Sounds a little familiar. I don't know. It's
Right? Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what is it? The power. Those who have none of it will do anything to get it, and those who have it will do anything to keep it. You
that's
know,
exact, man. That is absolutely the truth. And I think when you look at it, it's such a fascinating and such a brave, not just by Kubrick, by Burgess, who wrote the book. I mean, it's such a extremely brave notion to take somebody again as reprehensible as Alex is, and put it put it in the future, so we have a little bit of space. And you know what's really interesting about it is that when you look at it, they don't ever specify what the year is, but we get the idea that it's somewhere down the line, this dystopian sort
right?
of reality. And you know what's very interesting is that everything seems sort of flat and ugly and nondescript, and all of these terrible characters, these droogies, these gangs, they're the most colorful, full of life people, even though they're horrible. They're the worst
Right.
of the worst. But as people watching it, and as people who have flaws and have strengths, and you know, we look at it and we think to ourselves, gosh, man, that's more attractive than that is. And then we see these characters orbiting Alex, his droogies, the guys that he's been friends with that are in his gang, and you know, they're kind of two faced and not too strong and not too, convicted in what they believe. And then we've got the conservative politician who's going to use him for his own gains at the end. And every single person, from the chaplain in the prison to, you name it, to the liberal writer whose wife he raped, and and her he's got his agenda. They all have their agendas, um, and most of it has to do with trying to control the individual. It's really
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah. I think there's the chaplain who has that one line: "When a man cannot choose, he ceases to be a man."
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I think that free will versus control is one of those things that I think is common in both Game of Thrones and The Clockwork Orange. Is
yeah.
the more you exert control, the pendulum will swing back the other way, and there will be an accounting on the other end. And because at some point there will be some kind of balance that gets struck, whether that's the ice king horde coming down to destroy you, right, or something. But that kind of, I think, balance of free will versus control is fascinating, and always makes for good exploration of human nature, because that's in our nature. We have to have some type of free will, and if you take that from somebody, there will be a consequence.
I agree. So, what do you make of the arc of Daenerys? Like where she starts, where she
Right? Isn't
goes.
that the lesson, that power corrupts? That when you have the power of God, which she really does with the dragons, that it at some point she gives into that kind of power and that kind of control. And I think I didn't have any problem with what they did with her character at the end. I think I wasn't a fan
Great.
of I thought her character was handled correctly. There are other stuff I didn't like, but her character, I think, was true to the theme of the series, which is there are no heroes when you get at the top of the throne. It's very rare, right? And so, I thought that was the main lesson from her, arc is don't give in to power, because it will destroy you.
Right. The old absolute power corrupts absolutely, So, I mean,
Absolutely. I mean, then that happens time and again, in power is not really a human quality that we should embrace, I guess. What do you think? one of the things that I think the show does really well is in the Ludovico technique existed in Westeros, who's one villain you'd love to use it on?
Hmm. Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I guess I would have to go to, who do you feel is in your thought? I guess is Cersei the main? Is she the main antagonist of the piece? Do you feel?
Wow, that's a good question.
Because there's a few, there's a
Right.
few, and
Yeah,
then by the end, once again, good writing. And I do agree with you. There's things about the end that worked and didn't for me, but I almost found myself feeling sorry for her a little bit at
I
the end
did.
there. And
Absolutely.
yeah,
There was a lot of empathy. This is yes, she is evil, but empathetic evil. I feel you feel bad for her and what she had to go through, and why she turned out the way she did. There's an understanding of why she turned out like that, and you
yeah,
even felt it was, yes, incestuous, evil relationship, but there was also this kind of empathy for what they had, which is really weird as a viewer to feel that. You're like, why do I feel like that? But that is what you felt.
right. Because in a strange thing to do and to say, but it almost took the incest aspects of it and isolated it and removed it from our thought pattern. And we just at one point could look at it and say, these are two people that are fated to be in love with each other. And here they are in this situation that we all find repugnant, but there it is, and it's actually dealt with in such a way that by the time you get to that last episode, you're going, you've almost put it aside. It's not like you're condoning it or going, "Oh, yay, incest," but you're kind of looking at it and going, "Oh, yeah, I forgot about that being incest." It just seems like this is this fated couple, not unlike, but unlike a Romeo and Juliet sort of thing, because it is a basically fated couple. I mean, that is what it is, which
Yes,
is not
the,
dissimilar. So it's not even dissimilar to, like, back to Daenerys and Jon Snow. That's a really interesting thing too, in terms of, like, she becomes a villain too, and we found ourselves rooting for her. So when you ask that question, I'm not even sure who I could really identify as a villain full blown at the end of the is Littlefinger. Littlefinger was always this kind of slimy
right.
yuck. So when he's going down at the end there, it's sort of like, yeah, man, that guy.
Yeah. I think, yeah, I guess maybe he was the really probably one of the few characters that you really didn't have any kind of uh, when he died, everybody cheered. You were
We were happy.
there was there was no empathy for him at all.
And Ramsey was the other one with the dog. With the
Oh,
dog, I mean, it
yes.
was it was just like,
Well, I
yeah,
think, and with the what was little Joffrey when they poisoned him, I think it was like we all cheered about the child being murdered by
I
poison,
know,
because
dude.
he
I
was
mean,
just
that's crazy. I know both of them. I think were absolutely the pit. I mean, they were. There was very little redeeming aspects to either one of those characters in any way.
yes.
I think especially Ramsey in a way. I mean, it was just like, oh God, I don't. That guy was despicable. And I felt for the actor, because I have not seen the actor in anything since. Have you, or before? I don't know much
No,
about him on that.
no,
He did a really good job, but it's
he did.
really hard to play that role because there was nothing redeeming about that dude. And I think he had a decision that he had to make. I'm not sure what I would done in that role. I mean, obviously, I'm 25 years too old to play that role, 30 years too old. But I mean, he's that was a tough call, and he leaned into
I
it.
saw him on something else, but I couldn't get. It was hard for me to embrace the character he was playing because
Hmm.
I just saw Ramsey. And I'm trying to remember what it was, but that it's one of those characters where there's makes such an impact on you that it's hard to see them in anything else because
Right.
you're like, no, that's Ramsey. Yeah, I hate him. Yeah, I hate him.
I know. I saw, who was the character I just saw? the guy who is the eunuch, the bald guy,
Yes, Varys, right?
Harris.
Yeah.
I saw Varys in a sort of a Brit whodunit series.
Okay.
It's a pretty good one. I watched the first episode of it, and I was watching it with my wife, and we're like 15 minutes into it, and I'm like, that's Ferris. She's like, no. I'm like, yeah. I mean, there's a guy that really flipped the switch. So back to your original thing about like the villain and you know, it's so hard to say because by that last episode, every one of them had a certain amount of justification, and except for maybe um, uh, Daenerys, and she was like, what Jon Snow did there was such an interesting choice and an interesting thing that he did in
Right.
killing her. What an interesting choice he makes because he has to. You talk about choosing love, and people throw that around so so much these days, and I'm glad they do. But to understand it truly, there's love that can be between two people, romantic love, passionate love, that love. And then there's love that is a transcendent thing, like a larger mind love that's out there, that is a bigger love. And that's something I really thought was good about the ending. And I know the ending took a lot of beating, but the fact is that he did choose the larger love instead of his love. And I thought
Right.
that was such a great part of the character in that very last scene when, spoiler alert again, uh, when she dies. It's such a powerful scene, and it's such a powerful choice that he makes. And
Well, and I think you make a good point that I didn't mind the fact that Jon Snow killed her. I thought that was a good choice. I thought it was a good choice for have her go nuts and kill everyone. I thought that made sense. It was true to the dynamic of power. I just wanted Snow to end up the king. I felt like that should have been the way it goes. But I understand that they went a different route. But I just felt like,
let's stay
why
with
bring
that
him
for,
back to life if he wasn't going to end up the king?
right. So I'm going to stay with that with you because I'm really curious about this. So why is it? And I don't disagree. I'm just curious to hear your perspective on it. Why is it that you felt that Jon Snow should be king as opposed to Bran the Broken? Like, what is the reason that you feel that he didn't become king, and why maybe did Bran the Broken become king?
So I personally love my series finales and all series. I like things to have some kind of resolution
Mm-hmm.
and the balancing of the scales. Like, and this is just it's personal opinion, right? Totally subjective. But if you think of Breaking Bad at the series finale of that, there is this balancing of the scales that uh, is beautiful. I felt like, and so I when a series ends it in a way that doesn't allow for that. I
Hmm.
feel a little let down, and I felt like Jon Snow being the king and with his family ruling, would be like, okay, there's balance. Ned Stark gets his head cut off at the end, but at the end, at the beginning, but at the
Beginning.
end, at least his bastard son is now king and sitting on the Iron Throne. I felt like that would be a nice balancing, but it's just my opinion.
Yeah, I love the character, love the actor. Felt similar. When we were watching it. We both felt, my wife and I and my sons, we felt kind of ripped off too. I understand what you're saying, but as I've distanced myself from it a little bit, I think that if you think about what they did, it's kind of a classic thing where the messianic character, where the hero character, where the Christ character is always a little broken.
Hmm.
And I think that was literally by name the broken character, and also by way of what he was, that he could see past, future, present, and all the sides of things, and really stood for no side. I mean, really, in a certain respect, he was somewhat apolitical, and he was a character that basically represents, I think, where a lot of people stand these days, where we all kind of feel somewhat unrepresented and not exactly, you know, in a camp or any camp. I mean, I can say I feel that way at this stage of the game. I certainly have grown up a liberal, and that's been my viewpoint for most of my life. But now I find myself certainly not a conservative, certainly not a liberal. I see the common sense in all things, and I think that is kind of what Bran was a guy that responded to the situation on the table as opposed to siding with a camp. And
Mm.
I think that's what made him a good choice to be the king, or at least in the writers and producers' mind, the correct choice to
Yeah, I
be.
can see that perspective. I hadn't thought about that, how the messianic character is always broken. I hadn't I you know, you're right. I think they went with that. That makes a lot of sense. I wanted to ask you a question um, about kind of, I guess, there is something that's really interesting is what we see with the Lannisters regime in Westeros is they they didn't have psychiatrists with eye clamps. They just had executioners. you know, it, it was
It's true.
but there is still the abuse of power, and I think kind of different methods to get to the same place. But what do you think it says about just or what did you enjoy? I guess about watching the different portrayals of power from the establishment and how it can be abused, but also how its abuse spurs up rebellion or resistance. Rebellion versus the empire, rebellion versus, there's always that in any great, I think, universe. What does it kind of bring to your mind?
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? That just to pivot a little bit, come back to what you're saying about the Lannisters. It's fascinating that when George Lucas was putting that Star Wars idea together, that the rebellion was the Viet Cong.
Right.
And that kind of slipped by everybody. And even in THX 1138, was that THX 1138? Wasn't that his first
I think
deal?
so. Yeah.
He always sort of had that theme early on where he's very obsessed with good versus evil. It was more about a good versus evil, even though there was a hero's quest aspect to what he did, obviously with Luke, and that was a big part of it. Um, I think that this feeling of rebellion in the establishment or the established family or the rich family or the family on the top or the
Yeah.
guys on the hill,
Yeah.
that's the Lannisters, right? I think what was beautifully done about the situation with the Lannisters is if you look at it, it's a classically broken Shakespearean family.
Hmm.
It could be anything. It could be Lear, it could be Succession, it could be any of the above. Just pick one. It's the same basic idea, and Tywin is like he's that guy. He is that patriarch that basically sits there and pulls everything and knows which button to push and knows how to belittle each child in such a way that he can just basically destroy them. You talk about a guy that's a somewhat antagonist for
Yeah.
most of the piece. You can't get much more antagonistic than that guy is. He's a
Absolutely.
very dislikable character. So I think you look at the Lannisters in a certain respect, and it's sort of like the New England Patriots used to be, or it's like looking, it's
Yeah.
looking at these dynasties that we love them, we hate them, we're interested in them. What's the inside scoop? What's going on? And I think they really did a great job with getting our interest in people that again we might find to be somewhat reprehensible, but they found the human aspects because they found that inner family drama. And then by the time Joffrey comes around, it's like,
Yeah.
oh, it's the culmination of,
Right.
of the terror of the family, of the horror.
Yeah. Let me ask you, who is scarier as a tyrant, King Joffrey or Alex DeLarge?
King Joffrey is scarier to me because he lacks the personal depth and commitment to what it is that he is, which to me makes him more dangerous because he's a coward. Alex is not a coward. Um, he's a monster.
Yeah.
he's
Yeah.
he's a horror show,
Yeah.
but he's not a coward, and he's not full of crap. He's true to himself, and I think if we're looking at anything and we're looking at leaders, and like Bob Dylan says, don't follow leaders, watch the parking meters. I think that is as true today as it's ever been.
Yeah.
So if I had to choose the one, I would choose the one with integrity, which is definitely little Alex. He definitely has that more so than, than
Oh, that's
Joffrey.
great. That's great. Um, okay, well, I've got a couple. Let me give a couple of questions that I think would be fun. Uh, would Alex would Alex and his Droogs last a day in Westeros?
That's a good question. Wow, that's a good question. Uh, well, Alex would. I think they would. I'm going to say yes to both because Alex is got so much charm and personal strength, and he's extraordinarily intelligent, and he's a really good leader. So I think he's the type of person that could find his way in there. He
Kind of like Littlefinger. He's kind of got that conniving, smart,
he'd
charming
be a
guy.
good
Yeah,
hand. He'd be
yeah,
a really good hand, man.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I could see that happening, and of course the drinks would fit right in. I mean, they would be able to get in line and do what it is that they have to do. So yeah, I think he would. I think that all the boys would do well there. Yeah.
I agree. I agree. Um, well, I think a interesting thing that both of those shows take into account is using violence as a tool of dominance. And you see, of course, the Red Wedding is an infamous thing in Game of Thrones. The combat between Mountain and the Viper, all of those things. Um, how did these scenes make you feel about the perpetrators of violence? Did the Red Wedding or the wildfire at the September to solidify those characters for you as dominant forces? Did you feel any kind of like you know anger or anything like that, or in some cases I felt the violence was justified? But what kind of how did watching those different characters inflict that violence, what did it stir up in you? I'm curious.
It's a great question, and it stirred up a few things. The first thing that it stirred up when it was in a vengeful sense, like when Arya went back and had her revenge, was it appeals to our basis sense of revenge, and it feels good, like yes, and that's what was supposed to happen, and that's what I want to feel. And then it was strange, and this is something that the series did on a consistent basis with me, which I feel is hats off to them. I mean, Weiss and Benioff are masterful, and George R. R. Martin obviously masterful. Is they somehow at each step of the way, when the violence felt the most satisfying, after I sat in it for even the briefest amount of time, I felt this sadness and the compassion of the fact that this is a loss for somebody. Even Joffrey, Yucko Joffrey, when she was holding him, Cersei, and looking down at him,
Yeah,
I have three sons.
yeah,
I know that feeling. Not that my sons are beautiful and I love them, but I'm saying I know it's still your son, even if they're like my sons or they're like that son. That is still your son,
right.
And I felt that every time I was feeling maybe a little satisfied with the violence, there was something that they did that made me feel like, oh, this is violence, isn't it? At the worst of it, and we become so desensitized to it. Don't get me wrong, I love the revenge movie as much as the next guy, and I understand that genre and I understand the satisfaction in it. But do you remember when it first came out, Game of Thrones? Everybody was just like, "How could you like that?" Like the people that didn't like it were like, "It's just so violent. It's just like it's the bloodiest, most violent, horrible thing I've ever seen." And you know, I felt like the series actually took us on a journey of instead of it made us more sensitive towards violence, even though the violence didn't decrease when the things occurred, whether it was people's like heads physically being, exploded, like what was the character who was the swordsman, famous actor who plays him. I'm spacing on the name. But he gets his head crushed.
Well, yeah,
In
you're talking about when Pedro Pascal was on there.
Pedro Pascal, yeah. And, that was just, it was
Oh, that was
really
so violent.
Oberon. That was
Yeah,
Oberon. Wasn't it?
yeah.
It was like disturbing. It was like, wow, man. You don't get desensitized to that when you see it in some of the context that they put it in. One thing I do want to say too is this really interesting thing happened with the Iron Throne, you know, and the imagery of dragons. And I wanted to get to it before we wrap it just to say, isn't it really? I thought it was a good choice, and I want to see what you think. That the dragon actually melted down that throne. The very thing that for 8 seasons we watched them all blood, competing for, doing whatever they could to get that, to have that, that dragon melts it down. And if you look at myth in the truest sense, the dragon is always the thing that we have to slay in order to achieve whatever it is that we're supposed to achieve. And sometimes that dragon is us. So to make that decision to do that thing, and then to follow that with making Bran the king, I don't know, Nathan. I thought there were some real pluses to the end of that. I thought there
Yeah,
were things, that
there are
were.
pros and cons. I feel like, and that is one of the aspects of it that I like, was that there was that kind of resolution with the eye of everyone's, the source that they were all searching for power ends up getting destroyed at the end. I could appreciate, that kind of coming full circle. So that was true. Um, I thought on your when we come to violence, I think violence for the sake of violence is never compelling. I think we've seen so much of it. It's not really, it doesn't grab the eyes just because there's violence. I felt like Game of Thrones, what it did was it used violence, but it was part of a storytelling. It was part of the filmmaking. So it wasn't for nonsense. It was to make sure that these characters, you understand why they do what they do, because this is the world they're living in. And so you can't be a gentle pacifist in that world. It's not going to happen. You have, if you want to survive, there's a certain amount of brutalism that you have to have. And so I think it works because it's part of the character development. So I never felt like it was just exploitative violence, which, that exists, to each their own, but it wasn't like that at all. So on the Clockwork Orange, the one thing I wanted to ask you on violence was, there is the kind of violence, institutional violence, and then there is the kind of individual violence, or the violence of the system. And I'm curious, if one of those portrayals disturbed you more, right? The chaotic violence of Alex, or the clinical manipulative violence, of the Ludovico technique. Was Is one of those more disturbing to you?
Yeah, with the Ludovico technique, the one thing that was a powerful point that they make is that he lost the one bit of beauty and humanity in the horrible things that he did, was the fact that Beethoven was was the underlying thing there. And when he was doing the technique, he was like, "It's a sin, it's a sin." And they're like, "What's a sin? What's a sin?" And it's like, it's a sin that he was getting sick now from the music from Beethoven, because that was the only beauty left in who he was. So if you look at it and you look at these broad strokes of horror that Alex is doing, raping, murdering, what he is, and you look at what they're doing, which is more surgical, they're both pretty terrible. The thing that both of them have in common is they both have what anything has to have in order to execute that sort of violence, whether it's state violence, personal violence, whatever the situation is you have to dehumanize the person that you're committing
Mm,
that to, so that you
yeah.
have no compassion whatsoever for that person, no feeling of the fact that, however you choose to look at it, if you look at the we're all one, or you look at what the situation is, let's face it, the first thing that we always do, whether we do it in our news cycles or our governments do it, we always sort of dehumanize that person on the other side. And so I think that what the state was doing was the epitome of that with Alex, is that they were dehumanizing him. They were taking away everything that made him a human. Um, Gosh, if I had to pick one or the other, boy, that's a tough thing to say because it was so brutal. His acts were so brutal and they were so atrocious that how can you say, yes, that was not as bad? But then you look at what the government did and it's horrible too, because you also have to look at what the means to the end was for the government, which was to basically, as you said earlier, well put, was to, control everybody. And when you control, that's when you can start to systematically rape and murder and kill. And you can kill children and you can do things, bomb and do things in the name of governments, in the name of ideologies, in the name of anything. And, such a short step to do that. So that's, first of all, that's a fascinating question of which I wish I could give you a straight answer on, but I can't because they're just both so frigging horrible that I
Right.
can't
Well,
really.
it's interesting. It's I don't think you can have one being worth it worse than the other. They're both horrifying. Uh, I will say that to me, it's scarier when an establishment or institution is doing horrible things because they usually have the power to do it on a grand scale. And so to me, those things are, rather than one person being dangerous, it's a whole institution. And I think that's one thing that both Game of Thrones and The Clockwork Orange did great, is in the transition of any organization or government or establishment or institution, when it gets very powerful, at some point it begins to protect itself more than those that it was once dedicated to serve.
Good point.
And they both
Absolutely.
do that great. And
Yeah.
it's whether it's a futuristic dystopian or it's an ancient medieval, like it doesn't matter, right? Because that is part of what happens with power, is, and so they're both great lessons in that. I think, I'm sure, uh we've both seen that in real life, and it's something that,
Oh, unfortunately, far too often. And to your point, great point. To your point, at the end there, in the movie, when Alex is sitting in the bed and he's in the hospital and he's on the mend and they've restored him back to his horrible self, um, and this right wing, a control freak guy who's I guess he was the prime minister or whoever he is, and he's recruiting him for his political purposes. And the choice that they made there that was just brilliant is that he's feeding him in the scene, and Alex is eating like a little bird, like a little bird in the nest, and it's like the mother bird feeding its little vulture
yeah,
child.
yeah,
It's like, oh, and he says he's back again. Do you know they tried to get him to cut that out of the movie? They didn't want it to end that way.
really,
Yeah, they didn't
huh?
want him. They didn't want
I
it to
didn't know
end
that.
with him being like, I'm back to rape and kill, just like I
Yeah.
was before. They didn't want that, but that was really, and you think about the times when that came out. That was that when you talk a time when things were really super divided, and you had so much distrust for authority. Uh, wow, what a strong statement that was.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, we were
how,
talking about that. Me and another guest were talking about, there was a time in that kind of 70s and 80s where filmmakers did a lot of futuristic, dark, dystopian stuff, Soylent Green, and where
oh,
it was like that, that kind of,
phenomenal movie. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, and because of the times that were going on, and it was heavily impacted by that. And
for sure.
so I think it's phenomenal. I think that we get to do that in science fiction, fantasy. We get to explore contemporaneous themes through that way of making films. So that's great.
Well, absolutely, like the original Planet of the Apes, another one too.
Yes.
Which just I mean, it's yeah. I mean, it was definitely a time, and I don't know. I don't know where things are going to go now, Nathan. I'm not sure what the state of film is. I know these series have changed the landscape of things, and I think I'm for them. I think they're fantastic. I just hope that they don't supplant film, because I think there's a place for film as well. And I think
Yes.
both things are fantastic. I heard, I don't know where I heard this, but it was pretty startling. And I actually tried this out on some people that I know that aren't in the industry. And I asked them, who won the Academy Award for Best Actress this year? What was the best film? Who won for Best Actor? Couldn't say.
Yeah.
Find that to be pretty amazing. Quite different from you're quite a bit younger than I am, but even still, I think you could probably remember a time when everybody knew the answers to that.
Well, I mean, when I grew up, for me it was 80s, 90s, but like if you look at the 90s Academy Award winners for Best Picture, Best Actor, man, I knew all of those movies. I watched all those movies, worshiped those. That was my film school, right? And it was, Schindler's List, Titanic, I mean, it was just like monsters,
Right.
right? Uh,
Terminator 2, Terminator. I
right.
mean, those were just
Yeah.
giant things, man.
Yeah. And it was great. And so I think, the Academy in recent years, it's been much more obscure winners, obscure movies and winners. And so I think there is a way to make movies that are incredible pictures, take out Schindler's List or Titanic, incredible pictures, and also very enjoyable, like Oppenheimer's a recent one. Oppenheimer,
Fantastic.
incredible movie, and
Love that.
everyone loved it, right? So there is ways to do it, and I think you're absolutely right. Movies do that uniquely, that series really can't. I love going to the theater. I wish more people did. I think it's a shame that we're kind of losing that, but maybe we'll come back.
Yeah, my son, my youngest is 17, and he's really into it. And when I told him I was doing this podcast, I do a few of these, and he was completely psyched up about this. And he's a bit of a film and a theater geek. He wants to be a writer. He's going to Bard College next year, and
Ah, great. That's great.
yeah, he's super psyched, and yeah, he's very much into it. So, and I asked him, I said, "Is this you, or are you kind of indicative of a lot of the kids your age?" And he said, "No, no, no. A lot of the kids my age are really into it, and like even things like Dungeons and Dragons. He's like massively into Dungeons and Dragons. Like he started it in his school, in high school, and I think he's already like reached out, and he's going to be doing it at Bard too. So I think
Oh,
this
that's great.
fantasy myth world, and which film is so great, and going to the movie theater and seeing that altar of light up there and being able to watch it, it's different from seeing it at home. It is a
Yeah,
different thing. Both things are great, but I think maybe these kids they're gonna carry it on and keep going. I hope so, man,
I
because
hope so too.
it'll
I
keep
hope
you
so
and me in
too.
business, too. So
Yeah.
that's a good thing.
I hope so too. Well, Dean, thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. This has been a fun conversation for me. So it's been great. Is there anything that's coming up that you'd like to talk about coming up that you're coming up on, or a website you'd like to drive people to look at? Anything at all?
Well, first of all, thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you. You're a really bright guy, and a fun guy, and just
Thank you.
full of knowledge. And it was an honor to talk to you and hang out with you. Um, Personally, I have something coming up right now called Gringo Hunters. I'm going to be on Netflix. It's a series that's produced by Ronnie Howard, Imagine, and it,
Oh,
it's going to
I
start
hadn't
July.
heard of that one. Gringo Hunters. Okay.
Gringo Hunters. Yeah, it starts July. I think July 7th, and I play the eighth richest man in the world, which is so
Okay.
it's really going to challenge my acting abilities, because that is for sure not the case, man. So that's coming up in July, and also just something that's floating out there that I can only guess if your listeners are anything like you, bright and inquisitive. There is something out there, these telepathy tapes, which are very interesting to look at and to listen to. I don't know if you've checked much of this out, but it's
No, I
really
haven't.
fascinating. I really can't recommend it enough. It really deals with these kids that are non-speaking, and it's just amazing, these telepathic abilities that these kids have. I'm not even going to say it because I couldn't do justice, and we would have to do another 1 hour segment. But I really encourage everybody to check it out. It's called the Telepathy Tapes, and it's brilliant, and it's really amazing, and it's really life affirming, and it's really cool, and it's like science fiction is real. It's some real stuff. I
Yeah. Great. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. We'll definitely Gringo Hunters and the telepathy tapes. Those are two that I'm going to check out for sure. All right. Well, thank you, Dean. Thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Nathan, thanks for having me, man. Blessings, and I appreciate you, brother.
Thanks.